Today's show is sponsored by Smart. Stay tuned at the end of the show to learn how I'm using my interactive display to enhance my teaching. Why we still need to know things in the age of Google, episode 264.
The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today.
So today we're talking to my friend, Dr. Justin Reich, and it's so nice to run into your friends at conferences. Justin's actually come and see my classroom at Westwood, but we ran into each other recently in Dubai and literally had this amazing conversation in the middle of the desert, sitting on cushions, eating with our hands in Dubai. And I was sitting there thinking, man, why don't I have my microphone? So Justin has since traveled to Malaysia, traveled back home, and I'm back home. And so we're going to talk today about some of the latest research in education technology, and we will link to these in the show notes. So Justin, what's some of the recent things out there that have kind of perked your interest?
Well, it's so nice to be talking with you, Vicki, and it was really fun to bump into you on the other side of the world. One of the things that we were talking about was sort of critical thinking and problem-solving skills, and I'll use a very specific phrase, which is domain-independent problem-solving skills. Those would be problem-solving skills that we hope would be universal, would be useful in lots of different places and lots of different contexts. And one of the things that psychologists have studied for a long time and actually have increasingly good evidence about is how hard it is for people to learn domain-independent problem-solving skills and how much of our learning really seems to be constrained to the areas in which we're studying.
When you say domain-independent, you're saying, math problem-solving skills versus the problem-solving required to write a research paper or the problem-solving required in chess. I mean, that's what you're meaning, right?
I think a lot of educators hope that we can nurture in students this thing called critical thinking, and then whatever students encounter, they'll have this domain-independent critical thinking skill that they can bring to lots of different areas and lots of different domains. And there's all kinds of research to suggest that actually our problem-solving skills tend to be local to particular areas, particular places where we have domain expertise, where we know something about the topic that we're studying. Let me give you an amazing example from a research team led by Sam Weinberg at Stanford. So Sam wanted to know about how people determine whether or not things are true online or whether or not information is reputable online. And so he came up with a sort of clever test where he asked people to look at and evaluate a website from a group called the American College of Pediatrics. Now, the American College of Pediatrics is not the American Academy of Pediatrics. The American Academy of Pediatrics has tens of thousands of physicians who are members, and it's kind of the most well-recognized group guiding pediatrician clinical decision-making. The American College of Pediatrics is a virulently homophobic group who tries to practice pediatrics from a strong anti-gay perspective. And they just have a few hundred members. They're a very small sort of splinter group. So Sam was thinking, what experts can I talk to be able to get them to think aloud about how they parse information online? Can they tell that the American College of Pediatrics is a splinter group and not a mainstream group? So he does a series of tests on Stanford college students. Now, these are theoretically really, really bright folks, really talented people who've gotten into school, have done all kinds of research and other sorts of things, and actually only a tiny fraction of them can correctly identify that the American College of Pediatrics is a splinter group. So he tries another group that he's hoping will be experts. He tries history professors at Stanford. So these are people who nominally are the world's best people at analyzing historical information, parsing through sources, making sense of things. And something like only 40% of them sort of figure out that this is just a splinter group and not a reputable source. If there's anyone who should have sort of information literacy skills that would transfer across context, you would think it would be Stanford history professors, but they don't. the skill sets that they develop that are really, really powerful for making sense, sort of solving information literacy problems in historical archives, it turns out they don't transfer that well to solving problems on the internet. Now, the two groups that he did find that were excellent at solving these kinds of problems were Wikipedia editors and magazine fact checkers were the two groups that had a real expertise around this. And we actually find these kinds of patterns in all sorts of places. So chess experts are typically not any better at playing checkers than anyone else is. They don't learn some domain independent sort of strategic thinking skill. The thing which seems to most distinguish chess players is that they have an encyclopedic knowledge of different kinds of positions that show up commonly in chess. There's all kinds of evidence from reading. Dan Willingham has great stuff about this. It says, teaching reading comprehension skills is a good thing. It can help your students, but it actually sort of helps your students a little bit. The main thing that predicts people's reading fluency is how much they know in a domain. So if you have a kid who's super passionate about soccer and you get them to do some reading in soccer, you'll find out they're a pretty good reader. If you take a kid, who knows nothing about the desert and have them read passages about the desert, you'll find out that they're not a very good reader. But it's not really whether they're a good reader or not. It's not really a question of whether they have really good sort of domain independent reading comprehension skills. It's whether they know something specific about that domain. So I think this has a lot of consequences for how we think about the work that we do as educators. It's totally natural to have this real hope that problem solving skills or critical thinking skills would transfer really well from one domain to another. But it turns out that when we try to find really clever ways of testing that, it just doesn't. What matters a lot, if you want to be a real expert in a domain, if you want to be a real critical thinker, careful reader, careful analyst, it seems like there's no substitute for knowing an awful lot in that domain.
Well, and would also point to the fact that, some K through 12 schools, they have one teacher who really is they're the teacher who teaches critical thinking, right? Whether they're a history teacher or a lit teacher or a math teacher. And there is sometimes a thinking, as long as we have one of, quote, those teachers who teaches critical thinking, everybody's okay because everybody's learning it. But what you're saying is there's really an imperative that every single subject area has an element of teaching critical thinking.
That what critical thinking is connected to domains. So people who are really good at problem solving in math, they know a lot of math. There's probably some sort of math strategies that are domain independent that you could use across lots of different kinds of math domains, but most of them are domain specific. Another way to think about it in terms of having, every teacher absolutely should be giving students challenges that lets them synthesize different materials, that lets them be creative, that lets them create and generate new information. But another thing that's really important is that the most creative and generative thinkers that we have also know a lot of stuff in their domain. And so, there's, I think, another sense that people have is something like, well, anything that you can Google, you don't need to learn anymore. But for instance, like every single chess position basically is Googleable. But what distinguishes really expert chess players is they don't have to Google them, that they have an encyclopedic knowledge that they can do a kind of search across that space that a search algorithm can't. And so as important as it is to have students that are solving really interesting, complex, generative problems in each subject area, it's also important that people know a lot of stuff in those areas. The way that we become creative in a domain is by having a lot of knowledge in that domain.
And then the other thing it would point to is that the need for really understanding student interest, because if what you're saying is true, for example, about reading, if you have that student who loves soccer, then aren't you going to teach better reading if you allow that student to read about soccer? Or if you work math problems relating to soccer, or if you're working science problems relating to soccer. I mean, I'm not saying that every single class has to customize to every single student, but at least knowing their interests, can't we take them further?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think interest-driven learning can be really powerful. I think it's important to keep in mind that if students' interests tend to overlap with the kinds of things that we study in academic areas, they're going to look smarter to us than if their interests are in areas that are outside those academic areas. So a lot of the things that we test, a lot of the things that we evaluate, questions on standardized tests are about things within academic areas. And if students' interests sort of align with that, they will appear to us smarter by those test scores and so forth than they will if their interests are in other kinds of domains, which might actually be just as important. One of the things about schools is that we have to, there's far too much knowledge that's been generated across the world for us to teach everything. And so we sample out of that. We choose some things that we think are important. And, it's important to recognize that there's a ton of really great and really important things that we don't teach that can be, that students can be really passionate about and access about. The other side of the coin is to recognize that one of the best ways that we can serve students is to help them learn, there's a little bit that we can do to help people develop domain-independent problem-solving skills. Like one set of strategies that I think is really useful are design thinking skills. Design thinking is a great kind of generic approach to solving problems. But if we want students to be really good at solving problems in particular domains, if we want them to be really good history problem solvers, they got to know a lot about history. They have to know facts. They have to know information. They have to know relationships. They have to know chronology. A sort of crucial piece of this is that as much as we might hope what they get towards is being able to do really generative, creative work, a prerequisite for doing really generative, creative work is knowing a lot of stuff in that particular domain. And these are super hard questions that actually different disciplines do sort of take different approaches to how they think about what counts as the most important content. So I feel like sort of literature teachers a long time ago more or less gave up the idea of a canon and said, look, there's just like way too many good books out there for anyone to ever read. And that's fine. We just need to sort of selectively sample. We need to make good choices about, we should have people do some reading within the United States and beyond the United States. We should have people do some reading that's contemporary and in the past. But even within those broad categories, there's a zillion different things, a zillion different books that kids might read. And so we should choose some things that we think are important for everyone. And then we should give students a lot of choice to explore what they're most passionate about. There are other subjects, math is probably the one which is least flexible about saying, actually linear algebra is just as valuable as calculus is. But for whatever reason, we've decided that calculus is the really important endpoint in high school mathematics and linear algebra, students don't have to get to until they get to graduate school or something like that. But these are, I could imagine a mathematics in the future that has more branches, has more pathways, and to some extent lets us say, like, oh, you're really interested in engineering? Like calculus is super important for that. Oh, you're really interested in computer programming and machine learning and artificial intelligence? Well, linear algebra is really important for that. So all these things are sort of implicated in what kinds of choices we help students make about what they learn.
So teachers, there's a lot that we can get out of this conversation. And I wish we had time for more because he and I had a far-ranging conversation and my students were kind of listening there with their mouths open and their eyes wide. But it comes down to why we still need to know things. There are those who say, well, why teach anything? You can Google everything. Well, there's no replacement for knowledge in between your ears and truly thinking critically in a variety of subjects, harnessing student interests, and realizing that we do still need to really have deep domain knowledge, all of us in our area of expertise, I think really values the importance of education and what we're teaching in the Google age. So thanks for listening, and I hope this gives you a lot to think about, and we will include this information in the show notes.
Thanks so much, Vicki. It was really fun to have the conversation with you.
This week, I'll be sharing the 7 pedagogical shifts that make interactive displays a key to a student-centered classroom on the Cool Cat Teacher blog, sponsored by Smart Technologies. Shift number 1 is that students are collaborators. My interactive display is the common workspace for the whole class. I use it as a digital workspace to display any screen for the whole class to see, as a large multi-touch drawing and brainstorming space, and so much more. My interactive display is a must-have device for me as a teacher.
Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.